On this day in history, April 3rd, 1043, Edward the Confessor is crowned King of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Edward. Edward the Confessor died 1066, so called on account of his reputation for sanctity. King of the English, was the son of Ethelred II, the Unready, and Emma, daughter of Richard, Duke of Normandy, and was born at Islip in Oxfordshire. On the recognition of Svein as King of England in 1013, Ethelred, with his wife and family, took refuge in Normandy, and Edward continued to reside at the Norman court until he was recalled in 1041 by Hardicanute. He appears to have been formally recognized as heir to the throne, if not actually associated in the kinship, and on the death of Hardicanute in 1042, all folk received to be king, though his actual coronation was delayed until Easter 1043. A few months later, Edward, in conjunction with the three great earls of the kingdom, made a raid on the Queen Mother Ealhgefu, or Emma, seized all her possessions, and compelled her to live in retirement. In the earlier years of the reign, the influence of Earl Goodwine was predominant, though not unopposed. His daughter Edith, or Eadgith, became Edward's queen in 1045. But the king's personal tastes inclined much more to foreigners than to Englishmen, and he fell more and more into the hands of foreign favorites from beyond the sea. Between Godwin, representing the spirit of nationalism, and these favorites, especially their leader, Robert of Jumièges, successively Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury, there was war to the knife. In 1046, Magnus, King of Norway, who had succeeded Hardicanute in Denmark, had claimed to succeed him in England as well, threatened an invasion, but the necessity of defending Denmark against his rival Svein Estrithson prevented him from carrying it into effect. In 1049, Godwin's son Svein, who had been outlawed for the seduction of Abbess of Leominster, returned and demanded his restoration. This was refused, and Svein returned into exile, but not before he had with foolish treachery murdered his young kinsman Bjorn. He was, however, inlawed next year. The influence of Godwin, already shaken, received a severe blow in 1051 in the appointment of Robert Jumièges to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the same year saw the triumph of the foreigners for the moment complete. Edward, indignant at the resistance offered by the men of Dover to the insolence of his brother-in-law Eustace of Boulogne and his French followers, ordered Godwin to punish the town. Godwin refused. The king, at the prompting of the archbishop, then summoned a meeting of the Witan, at which the old charge against Godwin of complicity in the murder of Etheling Alfred was to be revived. About the same time came news of a fresh outrage by the foreigners. Godwin gathered his forces and demanded redress, while the earls Leofric of Mercia and Siverd of Northumbria hastened to the side of the king. Civil war seemed imminent, but at length a compromise was effected by which the matter was referred to a meeting of the Witan to be held at London. At the appointed time, Godwin presented himself at Southwark, but his followers were rapidly deserting him, nor would the king give hostages for his security. Alarmed for his safety, he fled to Flanders, where his son Harold went to Ireland, but their exile was brief. The tale of Godwin excited universal sympathy, for he represented the cause of national independence. Encouraged by assurances from England, he sailed thither, and joining forces with Harold, sailed along the south coast and up the Thames. The king would have resisted, but found no support. Yielding to circumstances, he allowed himself to be reconciled, and Godwin and his house were restored to their old position. The queen at the same time was brought back from the monastery at Werwell, whither she had been dispatched at her father's flight. The foreigners had already ignominiously fled the country, and thenceforth the influence of Godwin, and, after his death, of Harold, was supreme. In 1063, Harold made a great expedition into Wales, in which he crushed the power of King Gruffudd, who was killed by his own people. But despite his prowess and his power, he was the minister of the king rather than his personal favorite. This latter position belonged to his younger brother Tostig, who, on the death of Siverd in 1055, was appointed Earl of Northumbria. Here, Tostig's severity and arbitrary temper rendered him intensely unpopular, and in 1065 Tostig's subjects broke into revolt. They elected Morkere as their earl. then, marching south, demanded Tostig's banishment. Edward desired to crush the revolt by force of arms, but he was overborne and forced to submit. The election of Morkere was recognized, and Tostig went into exile, intensely mortified at this humiliation, and henceforth his health failed rapidly. He was unable to be present at the consecration of his new Abbey of Westminster, the foundation of which had been the chief interest of his closing years, and on January 5th, 1066, he died. The virtues of Edward were monkish rather than kingly. In the qualities of a ruler, he was conspicuously deficient. Always dependent on others, he ever inclined to be the unworthier master, but the charm of his character for the monastic biographer, and the natural tendency to glorify the days before the Norman oppression began, combined to cast about his figure a halo which had not attached to it in life. Allowed to keep her property by William the Conqueror, his widow, Edith, passed the remainder of her life at Windsor, dying on December 19th, 1075.